This week's online lecture is about assessment practices within the Integrated Studies area. Just for your information, I've put a copy of the PowerPoint that's the basis of this lecture on the course website. A couple of the slides, for some weird reason, haven't come through properly on this particular tool, so it might be helpful to pick up the missing words from the PowerPoint copy. Before we get cracking, I want you to take a minute to write down what your initial thoughts are when you hear the word assessment. What do you already know about assessment? What questions have you got that you want to know? Before we get into a little bit more detail about assessment, I wanted to revisit the stages of curriculum design that we're taking you through in this Integrated Studies course. Many teachers start their curriculum planning with the activities. They've come across a really fun thing or a great looking thing that they've found on the internet or heard from another teacher, and they tend to build a unit of work around those activities. We want you to flip that, and we want you to start with the end in mind. Identify those desired results. What do you want the students to know how to do or what to understand when they leave this course? So in our language in this course, we're talking about what are the big ideas, what are the learning objectives and the intentions. What are the things you want the students to be able to do, know, or understand at the end of this unit that they don't already know how to do, know about, or understand now? The second step is to determine the acceptable evidence. What sort of things will reveal to you whether the students have actually achieved the learning objectives that you've identified? We call this assessment, and that's the subject of this particular lecture. The third and final part, not the first part, of the curriculum design process is to plan the learning experiences and your instruction. This is the bit that you can't really read. What sort of activities will you do that reinforce those learning objectives and that prepare the students for the assessment tasks that you've designed? That's where you start to plan the activities. When you are planning your assessments, it's really important that you align the assessments and the instructional activities that you then subsequently plan to your learning objectives or learning intentions. If you don't align them, if the things that you get the students to do in class, whether they're explicit instruction activities or assessment tasks that are designed to get them towards that learning objective, if you don't do that, then what the students focus on is the activity and not the learning. So they'll do what they have to do to complete the assessment, rather than focus their efforts on learning what we think is important. Let's take an example. Let's say we're doing a unit on the Olympics, and the big idea that underpins our unit on the Olympics, and yes, there can be one, is Australia's national identity. Our learning objective might be for students to demonstrate their understanding of the role in sport within Australian culture. But then you set an assessment task, and I've taken this seriously from the official Olympics unit from the Department of Education website. One of the activities that you would get the students to do on this matrix is to ask the students to compare the major muscle groups that are used in 5 Olympic sports. Is there a problem? Absolutely there's a problem. You might be doing a unit on biology, on anatomy, on muscle groups, the human body, but this objective is about understanding the role of sport within Australian culture, how it plays a role in our identity, who are we as Australians. But what you're doing is getting them to look at muscle groups used in 5 sports. There's no alignment there. They'll have fun, they'll learn about muscles, but how will this help them demonstrate their understanding of the role of sport within Australian culture? So when you're designing your assessments, make sure that they're actually measuring students' achievement of the learning objectives that you set. I'm pretty sure that you're all familiar with this particular diagram, and if you're not, then you damn well should be. So the principles of assessment that you would have covered already is assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. Let's start with assessment for learning. Take a minute and write down the assessment for learning strategies that you have seen being used in classrooms. Let's talk about what some of those strategies might be. Usually, assessment for learning starts with what the students already know. You have to solicit their prior knowledge through activities that also help them tune into the unit. You could use a Know What Learn chart. We've done that in the Island investigation. You could do a brainstorm. We've done a little bit of that. For primary school students, you could ask to them, and students with pre-literacy skills, ask them to draw what they know and talk about it with you. Here's a fun one, the four-corner rush, really designed for kinesthetic learners. Label 4 corners of the room with a different key idea, read a question or a statement that's connected to one of those ideas, then tell the students to go to the corner that they think is the most relevant or answers the questions. Turns it into a bit of a game and the students have a lot of fun, and you very quickly get an idea of who understands and who doesn't understand. A bit more on assessment for learning. How do you know when the children are getting it? Before it's too late and you have to move on to something else. Here are some other strategies that you might consider. Try questioning for understanding. This links back to the sorts of practices that we've been modelling in the tutorials. Try conferencing with the students, one-on-one or in small teams, to find out where they're up to and what their understandings are. Again, your questions will be key to unlocking whether they understand or not. Use observation. It's often an underused strategy, but can be incredibly useful. You will see stuff. You can do this through informal observation, but try using some formal observation tools. Develop some observation records of your own that relate to the sorts of learning intentions that you've developed. What are you looking for? Be quite specific, and then have a matrix of those criteria against the students. When you see that they're doing it, give them a tick. This way, you can map who's understanding and who's not, and use that to inform the teaching that you then go on with. Be prepared to shift your teaching plan to address those students where misconceptions and misunderstandings are being experienced. Don't just push on in the hope that they get it. So here's an example of an observation checklist that this particular teacher has developed. Here's another set of strategies. You could try the really unique approach of asking the students what they think that they know. Ask them to identify what the muddiest point is. What's the thing that they're most unclear about that's muddy? You could use the thumbs up, thumbs down strategy that Beck uses in her class and that she demonstrated and talked about in our face-to-face lecture last week. You could use traffic lights. Find a wall space, put a photo or a name of each student up on the wall. Ask them to put a traffic light, a red, orange or green traffic light, next to their photo or name. The students are assessing their own level of understanding, and by the colours of the traffic lights that you see on that part of your wall, you'll get a fairly quick snapshot of whether the class is understanding the concepts or not, or whether they need some more support. You can also get a snapshot of who specifically needs what level of additional support. You could ask them to write a one-sentence summary of what they have learnt or what their understanding of a particular concept is. Who does what to when, whom, when, where, why and how. You could also try the 5 whys. 5 whys, you start with a question saying, why is sport in Australia so important? And the children will answer you. And then you keep going with another why and another why until you guide the students towards that big idea understanding. So by the time you've asked the why question 5 times, you should have drilled down to some deep understanding rather than superficiality or superficial learning. Now we've talked a little bit about assessment for learning. I want you to draw a Y chart. And in that Y chart, in a single coloured pen, I want you to write down what does assessment for learning look like, sound like and feel like for a student in the classroom. Leave plenty of room because you're going to add to this Y chart throughout the lecture, and this will form the basis of your reflection for this week. Now let's move to assessment as learning. Write down some examples of assessment as learning that you've used or seen on placement. Not on your Y chart, please, not just yet. Just to remind you what assessment as learning is, where students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform future learning goals. Now let's talk about whether you've seen any of these. A learning log or a learning journal, what Richard Battersby might call a thinking book, can be a really useful way for students to assess their own learning. At the end of each session, they might write a reflection about what their learning has been, how they've been learning, what they think their learning goals might be as a consequence. As a teacher, however, you might need to provide them with some prompts. So the thinking book is borrowed from Karen Malone, and it's talked about in the Latham textbook, Learning to Teach. How about this one, a concept circle? Get the students to draw this little diagram, the blue diagram in the bottom corner. Get them to recall their key concepts or ideas that's related to the subject that you're teaching at the moment, the concept that you're teaching. Get them then to highlight or draw a box around any concept or idea that they're having trouble understanding. Get them then to record these ideas in their learning logs for further examination. So their misunderstandings or their difficulties form a basis for them establishing further future learning goals. How about you guys have a go at this now? Draw a concept circle and complete it for the island. What concepts have you learned? Which of the concepts are you having difficulty with or need to learn more about? Do another concept circle for the course. What concepts are you learning about that relate to teaching integrated studies? What concepts are you having difficulty with or would like to know more about? Reflect on these in your journal this week as well. Here's another couple. Here's a self-assessment rubric that you could design depending upon what you're teaching, and get the students to complete that as they move throughout their unit. Get them to check in with what they're able to do, what they might need help with. Here's another one. You could use this as a prompt for their learning journal, their thinking book. Get the students to identify their speed bumps and their detours. What were the challenges that they faced or are facing in their work? Are these speed bumps that are slowing them down because they're struggling to cope with the ideas? Or are they detours that require them to shift direction and go off and find out new things? Get them to think about how often they're having these speed bumps or detours. How steep are the bumps? How extensive are the detours? And get the children to think about how they're going to overcome or have overcome the speed bumps and the detours. Here are a couple of other rubrics or resources or pieces of paper that you could print off and provide to your students as reflection tools. So pass the remote. What would they like to rewind and have another think about? What do they want to remember from their work? What would they do differently? Change channels. What sort of thinking wasn't useful? Fast forward. What do you need to think of next? Or you could use the little smiley faces, emoticons, to help the students quickly and easily identify what they're having trouble with. Here are a couple of other examples of assessment as learning, particularly related to teamwork. And I think I used a similar one to these in the Cooperative Collaborative Learning lecture last week. Okay, so now it's reflection time. Take out your Y chart again. This time use a different colour. Write down what assessment as learning looks like, feels like and sounds like for a student in the classroom. Just remember to leave some room. There'll be one more entry to go. No prizes for guessing what the next one might relate to. Now we move on to assessment of learning. And this is the sort of assessment that most teachers have done the most of for the most time. It's the thing that at university we're also very good at. I guess what we're trying to model in this particular course is a little bit more assessment as learning and assessment for learning, which is much harder to achieve in a university environment than it should be in a school classroom. The possibilities for how you assess whether the students have learnt the sorts of concepts that you want them to learn or achieve their learning objectives are endless. They're limited only by your creativity and imagination as a teacher. And here are some to choose from, fairly common ones: the essays, the reports, the presentations, the great big cardboard projects, which personally are my pet hate. A diorama, use quizzes and tests, the old secondary school models, painting, drawing, flowcharts, diagrams, etc., etc. But how about you try some of these? This one here is an example of an iPad app, although it's also a Web 2 based tool, so you can use it on the computer. It's called Linoit. Padlet is another version of this. It's like a corkboard that you share with other people. And I think there's also an app that's called something like Corkboard or something like that. And students can use that to brainstorm ideas, to put up information, etc. This one over here is inspiration. It's one of the most versatile tools. These two here, particularly good for assessment for learning, identifying what the students already know and think that can inform how you then shape the sorts of teaching that you offer. Here's another one here. This is one of my favourites, and kids love doing this. This is an example of the life cycle of a water boatman done by a student at Ringwood North Primary School using a Web 2 application called Toondoo. And there are another number of them. You could use Toontastic, which is an iPad app that does a similar sort of thing, where the students can create their own cartoon or comic book. Here's another one. Get them to create a movie using iMovie. It's a really simple tool to use with iPads. You've got the camera and the editing tool all in one, and it's quite simple to use. But video is a really cool way and an effective way for children to demonstrate what it is that they know and understand. And that's what you're asking to do when you're looking at assessment of learning. You're asking the students to represent their learning, represent their knowledge and their understanding. Here are some other ones. Oops. Just get my pen going. This one's an infographic. These seem to be all the rage in the business world at the moment and taking off in education. Get the children to graphically represent what they know. Very few words, but pictures can paint 1,000 words. So start to play with the idea of infographics. This one here, get the children to use a blog. Kidblog.org or edublogs.org are great child-safe, school-friendly blogging tools for your kids to use. What have we got over here? This one over here, yes, it's called Glogster. It's the interactive online web-based, iPad-based, tablet-based version of your A3 poster, but it's an interactive poster. You can incorporate your own images, videos, music, as well as text and graphics. So it's also pretty cool and pretty popular. But again, just it's a way of your students representing what they know. And finally, we'll just change colours over here just to show you what I'm doing. This one, VoiceThread. I really urge you to think about VoiceThread. VoiceThread is a Web 2 based tool, so you need to use a computer. I think that there is an iPad app for it, not exactly sure. I should check that one out. Where students or you can load video, images, or text, or a PowerPoint, or some sort of file, lots of different file types, into a storyboard type of place, and other people, other children in the class can comment on that. They can comment on it. So it's another way of using multiple modes of communicating what and representing what the children know and understand. Here's another list of things that students can do to demonstrate their learning. So I talked about comic strips. Conduct a debate, write and perform a play or a dance, create an artwork, develop a rap, produce a collage, make some games. They could be board games or interactive games. I know that I favour the technology options, but I guess I'm just really trying to point out to you some non-traditional ways of assessing learning. Get them to write letters, develop concept maps, use a blog, use a wiki, create digital stories. Sonic Pix is another iPad app that you could use. And so the list goes on and is quite endless. Time for your final reflection. Take out the Y chart and another different pen, and by now you should be able to guess what the topic of this entry is going to be. That's right. What does assessment of learning look like, feel like, and sound like for a student? This week, instead of writing all of this up, take a picture of your Y chart and insert that into your reflective journal. But I want you to add 2 things to your reflective journal. In addition to the picture of your Y chart, I want you to share with us your concept circles that I talked about earlier. What have you learnt? What are you learning from the island? What have you learnt? What are you learning? What are the challenges and about concepts that are associated with the Integrated Studies course? That's the second thing. And the final thing is share with us your initial ideas for the assessment strategies that you'll use in your proposal to Richard Battersby. Do they align with your learning objectives? How will you know that the students are meeting or have met the objectives that you have set for them? And then next week, we'll talk about the explicit teaching and those instructional activities that you design for the curriculum proposal. See you then.